They say betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those who once kissed your forehead goodnight. But what if that betrayal was never a choice? What if it was written into your bloodline, long before you were born? Listen carefully. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a pattern. One that repeats through families like a curse disguised as tradition. A cycle of loyalty and silence, of love weaponized to keep you obedient. The night I handed my parents the keys to their new home, the 425,000 seaside mansion they'd dreamed of for half a century, there was a tremor in the air. My father's smile was practiced. My mother's hands trembled not from gratitude but something colder, guilt. The ocean outside seemed to know. It whispered like an accomplice. When I returned weeks later expecting laughter and warmth, I found only shadows. My mother's eyes didn't meet mine. My father stood behind her, stiff, rehearsed. And beside him, my brother-in-law, with the kind of smirk men wear when they think they've won. "This is my house," he said. My father didn't argue, my mother didn't speak, and that's when I understood the betrayal wasn't spontaneous, it was systemic, built over years of quiet conditioning, tiny compromises that taught them to serve authority instead of truth. They'd chosen submission, and I was just another sacrifice on the altar of keeping peace. The mansion I bought became a mirror, a cathedral of inherited weakness. Every brick whispered their fear of me breaking the pattern. Every window reflected generations who bowed instead of standing tall. You see, families aren't just collections of people, they're psychological machines, programmed to sustain hierarchy. And when one member tries to rewrite the script, the others, without even realizing it, become the defenders of the old code. That day, standing outside the house I'd paid for, I wasn't their son anymore. I was an intruder in the system I had dared to expose. And that's where our descent begins. Not just into betrayal, but into the anatomy of control itself. They say every family hides a secret room, not one made of walls and doors, but of silence, a place where truths are buried alive, and everyone agrees to pretend they don't to smell the rot. When I walked through the mansion that day, I could feel it. The air was too clean, the furniture too still. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether I would uncover what they'd built upon my gift. My mother's eyes darted toward the staircase every few seconds, like she feared something upstairs. My father's voice, once firm and grounded, now shook with rehearsed politeness. And my brother-in-law, the man who dared to call my father's home his, stood there like a guard at the gate of a kingdom that was never his. There was a smell of betrayal, faint, metallic, like rust and regret. I realized then that this house wasn't mine anymore. It had been converted, repurposed, turned into a shrine for their fear of me. But I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just looked around, absorbing it. The perfect architecture of manipulation. Because power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles and offers you tea. I could almost hear the whispers of generations before us, men who'd given everything to their families, only to be written out of their own story. Sons who built empires for parents who never wanted them to rise higher. The mansion was just the modern version of an ancient ritual, the obedient child punished for daring to become free. And there, in that echoing silence, I felt something shift. It wasn't anger, it was awakening. I understood that betrayal is never random, it's the universe forcing you to see who you've been serving all along. I turned to my mother, her tears trembling on the edge of her lashes, and I said quietly, "You don't have to explain, the house already did." She broke. My father looked away. My brother-in-law smirked, but his hands shook. That's when I realized I hadn't lost a home. I'd just discovered the truth beneath it. The truth that love, when corrupted by fear, becomes control. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The ocean outside was still, gray and heavy, like a sheet of metal waiting for the first strike of light. The mansion creaked softly, the kind of sound houses make when they know something is wrong. I walked through the hallway barefoot, tracing my fingers along the cold railing. Every photograph on the wall was a reminder. Birthdays, graduations, family vacations, smiles frozen in frames, proof that once love had been real. But the longer I stared, the more those smiles looked rehearsed, like portraits staged for a story no one believed anymore. In the kitchen, I found my father sitting alone. His hands were wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Your mother didn't sleep," he said quietly. "You've made things difficult." Those words hung in the air like a verdict. You've made things difficult. Not "you've been wronged," not "we're sorry," just a polite way of saying "stop waking us up." That's how control hides. Inside politeness, inside traditions that sound noble but bleed you dry. Families don't need whips or chains. They have phrases: be grateful, don't argue, do it for the family. Each one a thread in the net that keeps you where they want you. My father finally met my eyes. Behind his calm expression there was fear, not of me, but of change, of losing the order he'd spent decades maintaining. My gift had broken that order. It made him feel powerless, and powerless men will do anything to feel in control again. He stood, straightened his shirt, and said, "We've decided to keep the house. It's better this way." I didn't answer, because the real conversation wasn't happening in words. It was happening in the silence, the unspoken exchange of roles. I was no longer the son. I was the threat. That morning I walked out onto the balcony, the sea wind cutting through my thoughts. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about money or property. It was about power disguised as love, and once you see that, you can never go back to pretending you don't. That evening the house was quieter than ever, the kind of silence that hums just beneath the skin. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed, listening to the tide clawing at the rocks outside. Every crash felt like a heartbeat I no longer trusted. I started to wonder when the fear had begun, not theirs but mine. How many times had I obeyed because it was easier than confronting the look in my father's eyes? How many small compromises had turned into the cage I now called loyalty? Families don't break suddenly, they erode, one small surrender after another until you can't remember what you were protecting. My mother used to whisper, "Don't upset him, he's been through enough." I believed her. Every child wants to believe their parents' pain is sacred. Now, sitting in that house I'd built for them, I saw the truth. They had taught me to mistake obedience for love. They had inherited that lesson from theirs, and passed it down wrapped in guilt and tenderness. Generational devotion. It sounds noble, but it's just a contract signed in silence. I walked down the hallway again. The portraits seemed to tilt as I passed, watching. My grandmother's face stared out from one frame, stern and regal. I remembered stories about her, how she ruled the family after her husband died, how she demanded respect by keeping everyone indebted. My father had learned control from her the way most kids learn bedtime prayers. So this was the origin, fear masquerading as duty. They weren't cruel people, they were custodians of a ritual older than reason. Protect the hierarchy, keep peace at any cost. And I had disrupted it. In the dining room, the long table waited for a family that no longer existed. The polished wood reflected the chandelier's light like a pool of mercury. I saw my own reflection there. Tired, angry, but awake. The realization was simple and devastating. If you break the pattern, you become the villain in the story the pattern tells. Outside, the sea roared, louder, as if cheering the destruction of another illusion. I poured a glass of water, steadying my hands, and whispered to no one, "It ends with me." The house seemed to listen. Somewhere deep inside its walls, something finally exhaled. Morning light crawled across the dining table like a trespasser. It touched the silverware, the framed photos, the folded napkins that had never been used. My mother sat at the far end, shoulders drawn in, hands clutching a mug she didn't drink from. My father stood near the window, eyes on the horizon, pretending the sea was more interesting than the storm inside the room. I didn't plan to confront them, but truth has its own gravity. "Why did you let him claim the house?" I asked. The words landed softly, but they shook the air like thunder behind glass. My father's jaw tightened. "It was easier," he said. My mother flinched at the sound of it. Easier. The word hung between us like a wound we'd all been feeding. "Easier than honesty?" I asked. "Easier than standing beside your son?" He turned, slow and deliberate. "You've always needed to win," he said, "even when giving." There it was, the quiet accusation that had shadowed my whole life. Every success, every act of generosity twisted into arrogance. I'd grown up thinking I was helping them. But now I saw the truth. Control doesn't always come from dominance. It can hide in weakness, in the guilt that makes you keep proving yourself to people who stopped seeing you long ago. My mother whispered, "We didn't ask for the house." Her voice cracked on the last word. It wasn't a defense. It was a confession. For a moment, the whole world shrank to that dining room. The smell of salt, the creak of wood, the sound of my own pulse. I realized I wasn't fighting them anymore. I was fighting the invisible script written generations ago. They were just actors reading their lines. "I didn't buy this house to win," I said quietly. "I bought it so we could stop surviving and start living." No one answered. The chandelier above us flickered. Outside, gulls screamed over the surf like broken alarms. Something inside my father's posture gave way. Just slightly, but enough. He looked smaller, older, as if he finally saw what he'd lost by staying safe. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the fragile pause between denial and truth. After that morning, the house felt heavier, as if every beam carried the weight of what hadn't been said. My mother avoided me. My father hid behind errands that didn't exist. The only sound was the ocean dragging its breath across the shore. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into my father's study. The air was thick with the smell of paper and old varnish. Files were stacked with obsessive precision: tax returns, bank statements, letters bound with fading ribbon. On the desk lay a single folder marked property transfer. I opened it. There it was, the deed. My name had been crossed out, replaced with my brother-in-law's, signed by my father, dated 2 weeks after I'd handed them the keys. The ink had barely dried before they'd erased me. But deeper in the pile, I found the real reason: unpaid debts, medical bills, quiet loans my father had taken from that same brother-in-law over the years. The man who now claimed the house hadn't stolen it. He'd bought it piece by piece, with favors and silence. It wasn't just about money, it was leverage. My father had been trapped long before I gifted the mansion. Every polite dinner, every quiet compromise had been payment. When I gave them the house, I hadn't freed them. I'd handed the chains to someone else. My hands shook as I read. Rage came first, then a deeper ache, pity. They hadn't betrayed me out of malice. They'd done it to survive. That realization was worse than hatred. Because you can't fight desperation, you can only inherit it. My mother appeared in the doorway, pale in the lamplight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes told the whole story, years of fear disguised as love. "I found the papers," I said. She closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, tracing the map of a life spent apologizing for choices she never made. "They said it was the only way," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled far out to sea. For the first time, I understood that betrayal isn't always personal. Sometimes it's generational, passed down like debt, carried in silence until someone finally refuses to pay. I closed the folder gently. "Then it ends here," I said. And this time, even the house seemed to believe me. I found him on the terrace the next morning, leaning against the railing like he owned the sunrise. He looked at me over his coffee cup, a faint grin cutting across his face. "Didn't think you'd come back after last time," he said. I didn't answer. I let the silence breathe, until it started to work on him. Silence is a weapon most people never learn to use. It makes the confident ones reveal themselves. Finally he shrugged. "It's not personal. Your father owed me. You know how family works." I stepped closer. "You mean how control works." His grin faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough. "Look," he said. "Your parents are safe, the bills are covered. Everyone wins. Everyone but me," I said. He laughed softly. "You'll get over it. You always do." That was the moment the balance shifted. I realized I didn't need to shout or threaten. The truth had already started cracking the walls of this place. He just didn't know it yet. "You think owning this house means you own them," I said. "But what you've bought is their fear, and fear depreciates fast." He set the cup down, eyes narrowing. "Careful." "I'm past careful," I said. "I'm awake." He opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You see, you built your power on secrets, but secrets rot. They smell, and everyone in this house can already feel it." For the first time he looked uncertain. His shoulders stiffened. His hands found the railing, gripping hard. I turned to leave. "You might hold the deed," I said, "but I hold the truth. Let's see which lasts longer." As I walked back inside, the sea wind rose, rattling the windows. My mother was standing in the hallway, her eyes wide, not in fear but in something new. "Recognition," she whispered. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing he didn't already." "No," I replied. "Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give a manipulator isn't anger, it's a mirror. And once they see themselves clearly, their power begins to die." The rest of the day passed like a slow unraveling. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a silence that scraped against the walls. My father barely spoke. He sat in the living room with the TV on mute, staring through the reflection of his own face in the screen. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, rearranging things that didn't need to be touched. By sunset, the tension had grown so thick it felt alive. I found them both by the fireplace, the last light of the day crawling across their faces. "I spoke to him," I said. My father didn't react. My mother froze. "He won't be a problem for long." That got his attention. His eyes flicked toward mine, wary. What did you do? Nothing, I said. That's the point. I didn't need to. He looked confused. You don't understand how these things work, he muttered. Don't I asked. You traded your voice for safety, your freedom for peace. And for what? A house? A man's approval? He looked away. You think survival is noble, I continued. But it's just fear wearing its Sunday best. My mother's voice cracked. We did what we had to. I turned toward her. And that's what he counts on. That you'll always do what you have to. That you... mistake obedience for protection. The room went still. For the first time I saw something shift behind my father's eyes, a flicker of shame or maybe recognition. He'd built his life around the idea that control meant order, but standing there in that fading light, he looked like a man who finally saw the cost of it. He owns the deed, I said quietly, but not the story. That still belongs to us. My mother covered her mouth, trembling. My father's shoulders sagged, the weight of years pressing down. I could feel the house itself changing, the way the air moved, the way the silence sounded. Fear was starting to lose its shape. The truth didn't fix everything, it never does. But it started something, a shift in gravity, a fracture in the pattern, and in that small, fragile break, I saw something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning the sky was washed in gray, the kind that makes the sea look like molten iron. I left the house early, driving until the mansion was a shrinking blur in the rearview mirror. I wasn't running, I was gathering what was mine. I met with the lawyer who'd handled the property transfer. The office smelled of dust and old coffee. The man behind the desk barely looked up when I told him my name. But when I placed the original receipts, wire confirmations, and every record of the purchase in front of him, his eyes changed. You funded this entirely? He asked. Every cent, I said. I gifted it, no joint ownership, no conditions. He frowned. Then the transfer shouldn't have been possible without your consent. It wasn't rage that rose inside me, it was clarity. It happened, I said, so find out how. He promised to look. I left him with copies of everything and walked out into the damp air, my thoughts sharp, cold. Control isn't taken all at once, it's reclaimed in fragments. And this was the first. By the time I returned to the mansion, the sky had cleared. The house looked different, smaller, almost fragile. My brother-in-law's car was gone. My mother waited by the door, eyes swollen from crying. He left, she said. Your father told him to. For a second I couldn't move. Why? He said he was tired of being afraid, she whispered. Said you were right. Through the open windows came the sound of the sea, softer now, as if the tide itself had exhaled. I stepped inside. My father was in the study, the transfer papers lying torn on the desk. He didn't look at me. I called the lawyer, he said. Told him I signed under pressure. It'll take time to fix. It wasn't an apology, it was something harder, more real. A man unlearning submission. I nodded. That's all that matters. For the first time in years, he met my eyes without flinching. There was guilt there, but also relief. The house no longer felt cursed. It felt reclaimed, not through revenge, but through truth. Outside, the sea moved toward the shore again, slow, relentless, inevitable. People think betrayal ends when the truth comes out. It doesn't, it lingers. In the way you doubt yourself, in the silence that follows every conversation. Even when you win, you still hear the echo of the wound. That night I sat alone on the balcony, the ocean spread beneath me like a moving mirror. Every wave looked like a heartbeat. Every gust of wind carried fragments of the past. It's strange how clarity feels. It isn't triumph. It's weight. The kind that settles in your chest and says, now you know. Now you can't unsee. I thought about my parents asleep inside, about the life they'd built out of quiet compromises. I realized they hadn't chosen fear, they'd inherited it. Fear becomes culture when it's repeated long enough, and culture becomes cage when no one questions it. I used to believe loyalty was the highest virtue. That to question family was betrayal. But the truth is simpler and sharper. Loyalty without honesty is just slavery in disguise. That's what this house taught me, what they taught me without meaning to. I looked out over the dark water and spoke, not to them but to whoever might one day stand where I was standing. When you give everything and they still turn away, don't chase them. Don't beg to be understood. Understand yourself. Because once you do, their approval loses its power. A gull cut across the night sky, white against black, vanishing into the clouds. The moment felt almost sacred, like the universe quietly nodding. For the first time, I felt no anger, no need to prove anything. only a calm certainty that the cycle had broken. And if you're listening, if you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, remember this: the moment you stop needing their permission to exist, you become untouchable. So comment this once, right now. It ends with me. Then comment it again so the world knows you meant it. Because endings are declarations, and declarations change bloodlines. Morning broke without drama. No thunder, no storm, just light spilling through the windows like forgiveness. For the first time, the house didn't resist it. Dust glimmered in the air, and the sound of waves felt less like warning, more like rhythm. I walked through each room slowly. The furniture was the same, but it felt rearranged by truth itself. Where there had been tension, there was now space, room to breathe, to think, to begin. My father joined me in the hallway. His eyes were tired but clear. "I don't know how to fix everything," he said. "You don't have to," I told him. "You just have to stop hiding." He nodded once, and that was enough. Sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken. It's the moment when people stop pretending they don't see each other. Outside, my mother tended to the small garden near the porch. She looked up, caught my gaze, and smiled, tentative, uncertain, but real. It was the first time in years she'd smiled without asking permission. I realized then that healing doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes in quiet repetitions. Every choice to speak honestly, every refusal to kneel to fear. I stood at the edge of the property, where the sand met the grass, watching the tide pull back. The ocean hadn't changed, I had. I understood now that control isn't dominance or revenge. Real control is ownership of your own reactions. Of the story you tell yourself when the world betrays you. I closed my eyes, breathing in salt and morning air. The past wasn't gone, but it had lost its grip. The mansion, once a monument to pain, had become something else, a symbol of awareness. When I turned back, the house no longer looked like a battleground. It looked like a beginning. You can't rewrite what's been done, but you can decide what it means. That's the quiet revolution, the one no one can steal. I took one last deep breath and whispered, almost to the wind, "This time, it begins with me." The sea answered, steady and endless. Weeks passed. The mansion settled into a new rhythm. No raised voices, no tension hiding behind politeness. Only the sound of repairs, doors being oiled, windows unlatched, rooms airing out after years of quiet suffocation. I spent my days restoring the place, not for its beauty but for what it represented. Every nail, every coat of paint, was an act of reclaiming. My father helped when he could. My mother brought coffee to the porch, watching the sea and humming songs she hadn't sung in decades. One afternoon, while sanding the old banister, I found a small engraving carved beneath the wood, for the next to see. It wasn't mine. It must have been from some previous owner, long before our story. But it felt like a message across time. A reminder that every wound once healed becomes a signal for someone else lost in the dark. I realized that the mansion had never been about luxury. It was a mirror. It had shown each of us who we really were when faced with power, fear, and truth. And now, as light filled the hallways, it reflected something different. Ownership without control, strength without dominance. In the evenings, I'd stand by the balcony and watch the horizon blur into gold. The house creaked softly behind me, a living thing breathing again. My father joined me one evening, leaning on the railing. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. We watched the sun sink and the tide roll in. After a long silence, he murmured, "You were right to give it to us. We just weren't ready to receive it." I nodded. Maybe that's what gifts are for, to show what still needs to be learned. He smiled faintly. For the first time, it didn't feel forced. That night, I wrote in a small notebook, the same words that had been carved under the banister, for the next to see. Because every story once lived becomes a warning or a guide. The choice is ours. The sea roared outside, steady and endless. And for the first time since it all began, I felt peace not as an escape, but as proof that awakening, though painful, was worth the fall. Time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. By autumn, the mansion felt almost alive again. Its walls no longer whispered old arguments. They breathed with open windows, salt air, and the sound of footsteps that didn't hide. I started keeping the front gate unlocked. At first it was accidental, then it became deliberate. Curious people, travelers, neighbors, drifters would wander in, drawn by the sound of the sea and the strange peace that seemed to hang around the place. Some came to rest, others came to talk, and I listened. Stories spilled like tidewater, about broken families, debts, betrayals, quiet shame. I didn't offer advice, I offered space. Because sometimes that's all people need, a place where their voices don't echo back as judgment. My parents watched in quiet amazement. The house that had once divided us was slowly turning into something unspoken, half refuge, half confession booth. It wasn't planned. It just happened, the way healing does when no one's forcing it. I began to realize that maybe that was the real inheritance. The ability to take pain and repurpose it, to take what tried to destroy you and build a doorway through it. At night, after everyone left, I'd walk the halls alone. The boards would creak under my feet, steady and familiar. In the moonlight, the mansion looked almost weightless, as if it had forgiven itself. Sometimes I'd pause in front of the old banister, tracing the carving again. For the next to see, maybe that was why I'd been meant to come here, to live the story, survive it, and then leave a signpost for whoever came after. The ocean outside never stopped moving. It taught me that permanence isn't the point. Continuance is. You endure, you evolve, and you pass it on. I didn't know who would find this place next, but I hoped they'd feel what I finally understood. That betrayal is only the first chapter. What you build after it decides what kind of legend your pain becomes. Winter came without warning. The wind was sharp, the waves colder, but the house no longer feared the seasons. It had survived its storm. Word spread, slowly at first, then quickly. Strangers began to arrive not just out of curiosity, but out of need. Some came to leave behind pieces of their past. Others came because they'd heard that there was a place by the sea where people remembered how to begin again. I didn't call it anything. No name, no title on the gate, just light in the windows and warmth inside. My parents welcomed them too. My father would brew tea. My mother would listen, her eyes softer now. Sometimes she'd say, "You're safe here," and mean it. The mansion changed with every visitor. One brought books and left them in the study. Another painted the hallway. Someone built shelves out of driftwood for no reason other than beauty. Bit by bit, the house became a collage of stories. Every scar turned into structure, every pain into pattern. One night, a young man stood on the porch, trembling, unable to speak. He reminded me of myself years ago, staring at a door he wasn't Sue. He deserved to knock on. I opened it for him. "Come in," I said, "you're home now." He cried without sound. The ocean roared behind him. And I knew then what the mansion truly was. Not property, not inheritance, but proof that broken things can hold others together if someone dares to believe in their worth. Later that night, as I walked through the quiet rooms, I saw how the light fell across the walls. It looked like veins of gold running through cracked stone, like the old Japanese art of kintsugi, where shattered pottery is mended with gold to show that the break was part of its beauty. Maybe that's what we all are. Pieces remade by honesty. The wind rattled the windows gently, not in threat but in song. And I thought, this, finally, is legacy. Not the wealth, not the walls, but the courage to keep the doors open. Spring came again. The house bloomed with it, wildflowers creeping through the garden, ivy softening the edges of stone. The sea was calmer now, though it never stopped its endless rhythm. I'd learned to hear it differently, not as noise but as heartbeat. One morning I stood on the balcony with my coffee, the same spot where years ago everything had fallen apart. Below, a few travelers were already awake, talking quietly, laughing. My parents sat together near the steps, her hand resting lightly on his. It looked ordinary. It wasn't. It was a miracle disguised as mourning. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the silence, the breaking. All of it had been necessary. Because without it, none of us would have been forced to face what was hiding underneath, the truth that love without truth rots, and truth without love destroys. You need both, or you build your life on sand. I realized that the mansion wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever needed a place to remember themselves. It wasn't a house. It was a mirror that showed whoever entered that they could survive their own story. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the waves. I closed my eyes and breathed. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. The need for revenge, for apology, for understanding. It had all dissolved. In its place was something steadier, a kind of peace that didn't ask to be proven. If you're listening to this now, maybe you know that feeling. The ache of giving everything and being met with betrayal. Maybe you've stood at your own locked door, wondering why the people you love couldn't see your worth. This is your reminder. You don't need their permission to heal. You don't need their apology to move on. You only need to choose that the story ends differently with you, so say it once, say it twice. It ends with me. Not as a wish, but as a vow. Because legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you refuse to repeat. And when the tide pulls back, When the house stands silent in the salt and light, it will whisper the same words that saved me. For the next to see,